Well, with that, I give the floor over, or the Zoom box over to Tony.
Thank you. I was asked. I asked a couple friends of mine on several continents what I should say in this talk, and they gave. I got a set of questions that would be good if I was giving a talk, 4 or 5 talks like this in 5 days, 5 days straight. And I think part of it is if I asked Steve here, who is, I know, a banjoist and a knowledgeable banjoist, and makes very good comments in banjo forums online, I'd say, give an hour talk about white banjo players. Uh, it's like nailing in Canada, and they have this expression, nailing jello to the wall. And it even becomes bigger because as I think I said a little bit yesterday, or maybe that was just in it, that what has happened is those of us who are interested in old time music, blues, folk music, whatever, are the people who in the last 30 years have moved ahead to do what work that has been done about the history of the banjo in general, along with a few people who are banjo builders and banjo makers who are mostly people who play old time music. And so we're confronted with the fact that I'm confronted as I've tried to research that, is that this all sits into a larger world of the life of the banjo. And certainly, if we want to talk about African American banjo playing, uh, African American banjo playing is not contained by uh, just talking about old time music. And I'm not going to give one of these workshops where this is how I play Sally Gooden on the banjo or something. Hi, Howard. Hello, Alan. Uh, but so, what I want to make a brief talk, Marg. Uh, I want to make a brief talk about several points, and then I know people will have questions and want to talk about things, and that's what I'm quite sure that if I decided to talk about something, whatever it was, the questions that people have on other things would probably be more what we had to talk about, because this is my chance to talk uh, with you. Okay? And so we have this very large thing of African American banjo playing. We have, the issue that originally the banjo was created by black people from the Caribbean. And that's a question that we figured out in the last 10, 15 years. And mostly people thinking all sorts of other things about where the banjo came from, especially people thinking that the banjo came from Africa. And we could talk about the banjo tends to come to the current United States, both in the English areas, the 13 colonies areas, and to Louisiana, which was under the French, largely in the 1700s. And there may be some odd things of people who weren't African Americans playing banjos, but pretty much African Americans are the only people that we have reliable knowledge playing banjos in the 1700s. Uh, that's what I think, and it would be uh, it it that's what I'm saying. Okay, it could be possible that now here and there other people played banjos, but that most attempts to make that seem true don't seem to fit for me. And they follow the pattern that they should follow. If you look at the early history of the banjo, if you get Banjo Roots and Branches, a book that belongs in every home, I have three copies, you know. Early banjo sightings in North America pretty much are a reflection of where, in the 1700s, especially, where African Americans who have been enslaved, who have passed through or been taken from the Caribbean, where the banjo was created, were taken in North America, and especially around the Chesapeake Bay and in New York City, the first place where we had banjo sighting. And a tradition of African American banjo playing gets started associating the banjo more and more, that we know, especially in the 1700s, with spiritual practices. And Christina Gotti, you can just Google her, has done a lot more research based on what we've been able to find out in Suriname about what some of these practices are. The kind of standard feature of African American life in the Caribbean and in especially in the 17th century, is of on the free day that the enslaved have, especially on Sundays, of all kinds of, if people could gather to all kinds of dances that are related to not just entertainment but to spiritual practices, and the African people of African descent, like most people in the world, and probably most people in of European descent at that time, the separation between the physical and what I would call metaphysical, between spiritual and practical ways you live life on the earth, it was only coming into being. And this evolves very much into a separate African American uh, dance tradition that borrows from the European dance tradition. A lot of work has been done by people who study dance about the impact both in the Caribbean and in North America, especially in Virginia, of black dancing with the European set dancing traditions, among others. So, but these dances become, it's in the colonial period, they become a very important part of African American life. There are, I could tell you stories from books about slavery of an enslaved person, enslaved people who would risk all sorts of things, and like being beaten, being whipped, to steal away to go to a dance. Uh, and this becomes a central rallying point, a central way of that an African American community is being forged in North America, as opposed to separate African cultures. We used to see the banjo and look about the banjo a lot more in the direction of, well, if this was a continuation or assertion of particular African cultures and ethnicities in America, as opposed to something that tended to flow out of the creation of a new common African American ethnicity and culture, separate from the old African cultures. There's even, if you looking into some of the records we have and books we have of people saying, "My father is an African." He doesn't think we dance right. He doesn't think we should, you know, of enslaved people saying that, because this is a new thing that's being created as a new ethnicity is being created, rather than simply the continuation of something uh, from Africa. And again, this is the deeper we go into it, the more the idea is that most of us, the small circle of people who spend their time looking at banjo roots and banjo origins, look at it. But the big change for the banjo, I call it in the talk I gave, I think it was just last Sunday for Tom Collins' Banjo Quest, the big bang of the banjo does come when white uh, and very quickly after that, European people take up the banjo. It starts really with we can't find anybody who became a major banjo entertainer before the great Joel Walker Sweeney first performs in minstrelsy. Dan Emmett and his colleagues start the Virginia Minstrel. And this is all in the wake of the explosion of blackface entertainment that had started in the 1830s with a pronounced, T.D. Rice, who becomes he was if the only way the way I like to explain it, most of us are of the proper age who remember when Elvis came on the Ed Sullivan Show. Some of us remember him before the Ed Sullivan Show, but I don't want to out anybody's age. But when Rice, with his Jim Crow dance, becomes he becomes the most well-known entertainer in the English-speaking world. He becomes the highest paid entertainer. He was the highest paid entertainer either in the United States or England, and he traveled to England, other countries of Europe. But anyway, the explosion of minstrelsy changes the ball game both for African American banjoists and for European American banjoists. Because number one, the most important thing is it popularizes the hoop head or frame headed banjo as opposed to the gourd banjo. I don't want to hurt the feelings of the gourd banjo owners and players and fanciers and makers, many of whom are good friends of mine. But if the we had stayed with gourd banjos, the banjo might be like a number of instruments that came here from Africa or the Caribbean, that didn't make it. It's the frame headed banjo, you know, something like this, which Sweeney popularized. Uh, and Sweeney started out apparently playing a four string, then a five-string gourd banjo. But when he went to starting playing a five-string hoop-headed banjo, that was one of the most important moments in the history of the banjo, because this I know a number of people who've devoted their lives to making gourd banjos, and this is much easier to make than a gourd banjo. You don't need a climate where you can grow a gourd. Uh, every gourd banjo makers tell me every single gourd requires a different strategy. You can't have a production, and you can't get to a tubaphone, you know, with a gourd banjo, and it's easier not just for a musical instrument maker to make a frame-headed banjo, but it's easy for some person with the you know cheese boxes, salt boxes, other things like that, and some to make banjos. And the banjo spreads among African Americans. The banjo sightings uh, before the Civil War that we have, and they're limited because people were were relatively few, and the banjo playing by black people in their music grows with the popularization of the frame-headed banjo, and it grows both in terms of African Americans attempting to entertain, to have opportunities to entertain, even though African Americans were excluded from minstrelsy at the professional organization, the real thing of minstrelsy before the Civil War, but of trying to entertain with the banjo, having reception of it, and it strengthens the use of the banjo in black music, uh, even before the Civil War. Okay. So we have this after the Civil War, we have, just like in the rest of the music world, we have the unfolding of African American banjo playing in several different formats. You have African Americans who become very significant very quickly after the Civil War, uh, important show business banjoist. I'll put it that way. In minstrelsy and in forms of banjo that are developing in show business, using both the stroke style and in the finger style. And I'm not going to go into this. You can ask a question about that, but you have this happens. There are African American banjoists who tour the world. There are African American banjoists who participate in the black minstrel companies that start, and African American banjoists who are starting out uh, uh, and new forms of music that people who are revolting from minstrelsy were looking for. And there was African American banjoists inside what we might call the folk tradition. In times of the dances and and other entertainment, especially around the dancing that's going on in the 19th century, continuing the early dancing. And this really becomes, this is going on kind of parallel to the general and constantly interacting with the general banjo world. And a very distinct African American, and for us as people who follow old time music, I mean, that's who we are. Uh, a black banjo tradition as part of a black string band tradition and as part of the ragtime and the music really that came in the African American community came after uh, uh, or as old time, what we consider, I consider old. Everybody has their own judgment of what is old time music, but comes new music comes, especially among African Americans after starts to change. The music starts to change. What music people want uh, starts to change in, I would say, in the 90s, where new musics start to, I mean, I like I say, I want to give a fast talk and then we can just ask questions, but I set myself the task when I started to try to do academic work, this question: why don't uh, people, why this perception that African Americans don't play the banjo as much as white people? And I looked at this. It's an article that I wrote. Why black people put the banjo down. It's in a book called "Hidden in the Mix," and I'll try to post somewhere all the links to all these books I talk about in this. But basically, what happened is the music that African Americans, by and large, uh, became interested in uh, changed to musics that first were more oriented towards the plethora of different 4 and 8 string banjos that are descendants of the mandolin that came in starting in the early 1900s in both ragtime and jazz, and then the popularity of the guitar. And this was a thing that happened much more rapidly among African Americans than European uh, Americans, and that that there was a change away from the banjo. I found was not able to find anybody. I mean, I spent 3 or 4 years researching this, talking to some of the leading scholars of the blues and African American music. Anybody who said that African Americans stopped playing banjos because they were ashamed because it was connected with slavery or a minstrelsy or anything else. It's the music changed. People first found the tenor and the various mandolin banjos to be more useful, and there were hundreds of recordings of African Americans, not just in jazz, but of the new kind of raggy blues. D.K. Wilkes called this country ragtime that came up starting in the 90s. The banjo was not as, and of course in jazz, where the tenor banjo and the guitar banjo were a standard implement in the 1920s in jazz, and there were a number of, lots. But what happens largely is that the music changes, and that's basically what happened. That, okay, and what we're dealing with is a revival of looking at the last segments of African American banjo playing, and we have only little pieces of it. Uh, that is to say that, for example, I spent a long time studying Gus Cannon, famous. He was from Mississippi. He spent most of his life in Memphis. He had his biggest notoriety in his recordings with his jug band that he had between 1927 and 1930. Cannon could play the banjo. He could play the banjo. Bill Evans found this tape. I found this tape. Some college professor from the University of Memphis dropped by his house with a tape recorder one day in 1967, and people who know Cannon say it was a good day because Cannon was rarely sober as he appeared to be in this interview. And Cannon could play the banjo in his standard style that he made most of his recordings, uh, which was basically a version of what's now miscalled classic banjo. He used 4 fingers rather than 3. He plays the guy one of his first finger style thing he learned, which was a 6/8 jig. He plays for the guy, 2 finger style, and then he does some wonderful frailing on a couple tunes, and then he plays this chord style stuff that he says it's kind of like tenor. I try to learn tenor, but I felt I could do the same thing on a 5 string, and but just in this one guy who was unique, and he was lucky that he got recorded uh, uh, so much. But he shows what was there as opposed to, you know, and this great variety. There, I'm just going to stop. No, I'm going to go on a little bit further, but there's there's a rich variety of different African American banjo playing that's going on from the show business in the finger styles. In Merk Gribble, who Stu Jameson and Margaret Mayo recorded in the 1940s. Plays great, terrific string band music using three-finger rolls. You had Nathan Frazier, who John Work III and Alan Lomax recorded about in 1941 and 1942. He played a combination of finger picking and a kind of stroke style and a kind of regular claw hammer. And on some tunes, uh, he would play. He'd play. He'd play one part with two fingers, and he would play the finished part, another part of the tune. He'd play stroke style, and he was very creative person. But I'll just stop here because I think the main business is going to be the questions and the discussion about it. Is if that's all right.
Yes. All right. Well, should we? I'll pose the first question. This is from Steve Goldfield, who asks, "How do you think the banning of drumming in the South affected the growth of banjo popularity among African Americans?"
That's something that I'm not sure. Uh, I'm not sure about that. I mean, in one sense, I know a lot. It's a standard thing in things about early. Uh, First of all, wasn't officially. Drumming was officially banned after the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. The oldest picture we have of black people playing music in the current United States, and one of the oldest ones in the America is the old plantation, which was painted by a plantation owner in South Carolina of his slaves, and it's a picture of a banjoist and a drummer and other people. So, I think it had more to do. I think it was part of that, but I don't. The more I look, how effective this was. I mean, the WPA search in Georgia found a man who, in the 1930s, who could still make an African drum. I think that drum is in the British Museum now, almost identical to drums made in West Africa. I don't think that ban was as massive. I think people found the banjo to be a useful instrument for the kind of dancing they did, just as they did in places in the Caribbean where there weren't bans on drumming. It may have affected. I mean, to me, if I look in the slave narratives or the WPA in the interviews that the WPA did trying to find former slaves in the 1930s, the most frequent kind of performance setting for banjo playing is often a banjo and multiple forms of percussion, which was one of the forms that that the minstrels said they were doing to copy African American music, and so I don't think that the banjo was a substitute for drumming. I think that it was a positive thing. People found banjos to be useful for the music that and the dancing that had existed. That the instrument had been used before people got to America and continued that regardless of drumming, although there's lots and lots of if not with big drums, history and evidence that percussion being a very big part of of the black string bands. The string band that Sid Hemphill had in Mississippi had a bass drum. Uh, and especially in the Mississippi Valley, having a bass drum would be a very standard thing inside of African American string bands. And drumming, I mean, the drum kit as we use it now in jazz, everything like that was more or less invented by black show business people in the 1890s and the early 1900s. So I tend to, the more and more I think about it, the more and more I think that's not such a factor.
All right. Barry Cole asks, did the connection with tenor banjo and Celtic music come much after black banjo in America?
I don't know anything. I mean, I don't very know very much about the story of the tenor banjo as it reflects Ireland. I mean, tenor banjo didn't come into existence until formally as an instrument until 1910. It's kind of an amazing thing, and people started making them. There were mandolin banjos, and then there was a mandola banjo. Okay, I mean the instrument makers between the banjo makers and the mandolin makers were competing for market, and so you had banjo mandolins and mandolin banjos, and you had parallel banjos to the violin family, all the way to these bass banjos and all sorts of stuff in the 1890s and the early 1900s. And one of these was the mandola banjo. And what people were doing with the mandolin banjos is they were getting rid of two courses of strings. And because I couldn't. If they just had one course of strings, I might be speaking to a mandolin group instead of the banjo because I tried that first. But and so that's where the tenor banjo comes from. The mandola banjo, and it spread like wildfire in jazz because you could get a musician who was formally trained to read music, he could play that. And at least the story of it, especially in jazz. And it was loud. It was much louder than a guitar, and it could be played like picks, just like the plectrum banjos were started. People were just taking the fifth string off five string banjos and playing them because the kind of dance music that was coming up with ragtime, early jazz, it came with that, and that was kind of across the board. And it for a while they just wiped the five string banjo out in the popular market. But I do not know myself enough to say anything about its relationship with Ireland. But it doesn't come from Ireland. The mandolin banjos were invented by a man named Ferris from Hartford, Connecticut, which is a place where a lot of great people come from, in the 1890s, and they kind of descend from that.
You note there are no accounts of blacks citing they were feeling stigmatized by the banjo as a slave instrument. Do you have an understanding or opinion about the origin of the use of banjo jokes? Is it a classist white trope, a racist black trope, both, or neither?
Uh, there was a time in my life when I had the idea that I would learn the banjo, the viola, and the accordion. I mean, the banjo jokes are a standard bunch of jokes that exist for instruments that have gone out of style. And they also reflect the weakness, especially these fiddlers. the weakness and the insecurity of people who have not risen in their life to the status of banjo player. And I see many noble banjo players here, people that I admired, and it's just the small people of the world. But there's a standard set of jokes that are associated with instruments that no longer are on style. In 1910, when the banjo was the height of style, banjo players were probably making those jokes about some other instrument. I mean, in the Victorian era, the banjo was so stylish that people who wanted to be with it in the middle classes who didn't play banjos would buy banjos and put them in their parlor to show that they were proper people. So I don't think there's anything more to it than that, and except for that right now, relative to 1910, banjos are not as fashionable. But I don't think anybody would have understood a banjo joke that people make, say, in 1900, when the banjo was very popular. The current, or Queen Victoria, who was known to have a great liking for banjoists, and there are even for banjo playing and perhaps for certain banjoists, but that's another question, was still in office. Her son, Edward VII, who took banjo lessons from two Afro-Canadian banjoists who had a school in London, and her daughter, too, Ulf Jagfors from Sweden, found records that not only did Edward get banjo lessons, but his sister did, too. The banjos were once in style. I don't think there's any content except for anything that anything about that. I Go on.
All right. Um, this is from Rona Rothenberg, who asks, why are there so few black women musicians in country music? I was very taken by Rayona Ginnens, who participated and performed in the Ken Burns series Country Music. Can you tell us more about her and her contemporary female black country musicians?
Well, I'm not an expert on country music, though I have my opinions. But I know Rhiannon. I mean, I met. I still. She gave me this mouse pad about 15 years ago. Uh, Rhiannon is a very gifted musical musician. She has degrees in both violin and voice from the Oberlin Conservatory. When I met her, she was singing opera in an Italian restaurant in North Carolina, and had become interested in the banjo. I I think the standard obvious reasons. There are more black people participating in country music. I think what constitutes country music tends to yeah, Rachel, she sang opera. I've got anyway, but I shouldn't respond to these things there. But it's African Americans tend to look at country music as being branded white, and white people, and part of the branding of country music has tended to make it white, but uh, uh, I'm not going to answer. And I don't think there's anything more than what the average person would think about would be the answers to those questions. And it's kind of takes us away from the banjo.
Okay. Could you go over the Caribbean connection again about
Okay,
the
it's very. I mean, we all thought the group of people in the United States, Europe, and Africa, largely a couple of people helping us out in the Caribbean, that a bunch of us decided instead of BSing about it or saying things should be what we want them to be, a group of us started to work together and find how to, if we, instead of whining about the music historians doing research on the banjo, a lot of us were academics, and we got together, and it's reflected, and we looked at the history of the banjo, and and we looked at the history of the Caribbean, and we looked at the history of Europe, and the interactions and how slavery went on. Banjos, the earliest banjos are in the Caribbean. The earliest report of a banjo comes in Jamaica, probably from the 17, rather 1680s, and there are all sorts of reports on other islands in the Caribbean before there are reports of banjos being played anywhere else. And the transmission of the banjo to North America on the one hand and to Suriname uh, and Guyana on where it also went tend to follow when people from the Caribbean islands started being among the enslaved there. And there's no, especially as we started to look at African musical instruments, and the banjos have features. The earliest banjos have features that no instrument that's indigenous to Africa have. Uh, uh, so it seems to be, and the lead was really Dina Epstein, and she began her work in the 1950s, early 1960s, just because nobody else was doing it, and she said, well, the Caribbean islands were uh, more important than the colonial America. So if we look into uh, the literature about the French and English Caribbean, there probably just more of it, and we'll get a better picture of what's going on with black music in the slave period than we could in or an additional picture to what we could look in America. And certainly she pinpointed and probably focused on, although she didn't have any conclusions on it, all the early banjo playing that was going on in, in the Caribbean, and we basically followed all the other lines of approach. And again, most of the people involved in the research on this, like my late friend and hero Shlomo Pesco, and myself and stuff, thought we would find a path where banjos had been brought directly from Africa, but no such path existed. The path seems to have been that Africans in the New World created the banjo, combining features that were had by West African instruments with features that were had by instruments that had come from Europe. And there are continued banjo traditions and banjo music being played across the Caribbean today.
So, somebody asked how, like, Bella Fleck did that "Throw Down Your Heart,"
Yeah,
and
I,
that.
I, there's a confusion. Bello made this trip to go and play with musicians that he wanted to play with in mostly in East Africa. That I met Bella's brother, who made the movie just before they left, and talked about it. And Bella came to the Black Banjo gathering that we had in Boone, North Carolina in 2005, straight from the airport when he came back from that trip. That trip had nothing to do with going to places where, and he has been a very firm, strong supporter of the efforts of people to figure out the history of the banjo. It's a wonderful movie. everybody should get to see DVD or download it and look at it. And there were some West African musicians and not rather East and Central African musicians that he wanted to play music with because they were great musicians. None of whom were in any areas that we saw as part of the banjo's roots or played any instruments we think are connected to the banjo. They were just people that he wanted to pick with, and he has never claimed that. And like I say, he has been very directly, very extremely supportive. And like I say, I talked to his brother at the Banjo Collectors Gathering in 204 about the whole thing, and I talked to Bella he came, when days after he came back. So that's just it's a great movie. I mean, Africa is a big country, a big continent with hundreds of different cultures.
Okay, we have this question from Marge Chauvin, who asks, what form of music do you envision for black banjo music in the future? Would you expect to see more emphasis on banjo in traditional blues?
Uh, well, Mark is a longtime friend, somebody from South Florida, somebody. I've just went up to see her and Bill. They work in a state park about 15 miles from here, and they're great people. Uh, I I don't know what you know. I don't. People are going to do with banjos what they want, and I'm more of a student of what people have done with banjos, and I don't think anybody should do anything. I'm a great lover of this chapter in a book by this psychologist by Karen Horney called "The Tyranny of the Shoulds." You know, so I don't know. I know that I like the banjo. I know that a lot of people like me who are came out of the folk revival got interested in the banjo and old time banjo, and I know that there are a lot of young people who are playing music on banjos that have nothing to good to do with old time music. I think don't think I like to play the blues on the banjo. The first time I brought home my first good time banjo more than 20 years ago, I could sit down because if you can play blues in open G and you can do that on a banjo, even if you don't when you get one. But I don't think the blue. I think a fundamental thing about the banjo is not really suited because of its pitching to the playing the kind of blues that African Americans made and the direction of the blues. Of course, if you put a pickup on it like Otis Taylor, I mean, I see Otis Taylor play his own banjo with all the electronics on, and it sounds just like he has a solid body, electric banjo. It sounds just like that. So you can do all sorts of things with banjos. But I have no, I myself think that the guitar is a better instrument for people to play the blues on. But what I think and what happens, I'm pretty glad are not symmetrical.
All right, from Heath Kurtz, we have, could you please talk about African uppicking styles that may have transferred to the Americas?
Okay, Heath is a great man on the banjo. Well, I mean, we found that the uptick or the particular way that musicians in especially in Gambia and in Senegal play the accounting and a whole set of other instruments relating to it are very similar to frailing. And if people, when we first found out about this, people would hand a banjo to somebody, and it's very similar to drop thumb frailing, and so that there's a great similarity between the two. That's basically I'm sure Heath probably knows more. In some ways, can say more about it than I can. But there,
Tony,
there,
I was specifically asking about up picking styles.
up picking. I
Yeah,
thought you meant, yeah. The
down picking
two
is quite obvious.
the two besides the down picking, the two the most common form of banjo of lute playing in West Africa is two finger picking. Not and that's actually more widespread. And before we met Daniel Jota and other people, we knew much more people playing two finger. But the two finger picking is a very big part of African American banjo styles. Converse, in one of his memoirs, in that was, I think, either in the, I get the cadenza and the other one mixed up, says that when he was a teenager in Elmira, New York, he saw a, a black banjoist busking and playing in a style that he described, and there's a transcription that most people looking at it said that this is was two finger picking in a tuning pretty much that most people think it was the parallel of double C. And it's certainly, if it's the interesting thing that if you look at African American guitar playing, the two finger style, especially in the era of the blues, all of these great guitarists were two finger pickers. Gary Davis, I mean, I always thought until I asked people about it, or does all that work, and he would play much more. If you know people who actually study with him, he when particularly when Mrs. Davis wasn't around, and he was giving lessons, he would be doing these things by Duke Ellington, and showing them all sorts of things. But all of that stuff that he does is not three finger picking, but it's done in a two finger picking style, and that's just the basic uh, that's part of the African American heritage. Doc Boggs says that one of the things that inspired him in his permanent search to be an individual creator of his own new banjo styles is when he was a kid, he heard some black banjoists playing two finger style. So that is certainly one of the styles that has come from Africa along with the frailing. But then starting, with this, when people spread, people like Converse and the others spread the three finger style of the banjo that's now falsely or incorrectly called classic banjo, the guitar banjo style as it should be called. African Americans took it up, and there were, everybody's heard of Horace Weston, but there were many other African American musicians who were well-known exponents of that style. Like I said, Gus Cannon, that was his primary style. Gus, people who knew Gus said he looked down on people who couldn't, who played mainly in G. He played most of his recordings, and what he liked to play was in the classic banjo, the Pete Seeger, the drop and drop C, and he really saw himself as part of that world of the banjo, even though he was an excellent frailer and a wonderful two finger player.
All right. We have a few more questions if it's okay. We're running out of time. But Tony, how would you describe your approach to playing banjo, and who might have influenced your style of playing?
Well, I don't want to blame anybody. I'll put Howard here. No, I I came. I would say I came to the banjo fairly late. I was in my early 50s before I finally got a banjo. And I had been playing the guitar since I was 13. I had played with some great banjo players, particularly when I was a teenager or going to college in Hartford, with a guy named Don Sinetti. People in New England know him as Moose, still plays every Sunday at the Main Street Cafe in Manchester, Connecticut. Uh, and with Dick Fiji, that's maybe a few other people. He's more known. He's passed away. Who Eli Kaufman said that he felt Dick Fiji practiced more and was a better technical banjo player than anyone Eli had. If you don't know who Eli is, well, your life has perhaps needs to be expanded. But and I had a lot of misconceptions about clawhammer banjo because I thought I knew about it. Uh, my playing is influenced by listening to a lot. I've listened to a lot of black banjo players, mostly those on the Digital Library of Appalachia. The players on the and it's evolved. It's evolved. I tend to like brushing. There's a war against brushing going on, but I am a brusher. Okay, maybe not as much as I used to. Rufus Casey is probably one banjoist. I would say that I could not do anything on any instrument that wasn't in some way influenced by Earl Scruggs, even though I don't play the Scruggs style. Uh, uh, I mean, it's both black and white banjo players. Banjo player that I listen to a lot and wish I could emulate is Roscoe Holcomb, who I think is sadly not remembered enough. And I am a big fan of Doc Boggs. I keep one of my banjos tuned in his various deep tunings all the time. Uh, so I don't I don't try to imitate what somebody else did. They did their work. I don't like this. I realize to learn you have to look at what stand on the shoulder. But I don't like it's old time music. You get together with somebody. I'm going to play Rufus Johnson's left-handed jig, but not the version he played it on Wednesdays, but the versions that he played on Thursdays and the kind of nuance that he played it when it was raining. I think I try to develop playing the banjo to sound the way that I think it wants to, and I do it in a variety of different ways. I try when I learn the banjo, learn a tune. I try to learn how to play it in both clawhammer and two finger style if it's an old time tune, and if I can, try to learn it in a couple different tunings if it's important to me. And my I don't so I can't look at any banjoist that really at this stage after 20 years of it, I mean that I pattern myself after. There's some I wish I could pattern myself after, but I'm still working at it.
All right. Well, I think we have one more question, if that's okay. The question is, should we aging white banjo players develop sensitivities about playing old standards such as Turkey in the Straw? This is from William Duddy.
Okay, that's a complex question because number one, there's this history. Okay, about Turkey in the Straw. There was a song called Natchez Under the Hill, where which is the earliest what we know of. People combined a set of different Irish tunes together to make a fiddle tune. And I don't know about any words to Natchez Under the Hill, but Natchez Under the hill was a pretty wild place. It would have probably make Sugar Hill seem like Catholic school or something like that. And a guy named George Washington Dixon, who was a blackface performer. He came before Rice. Uh, Wrote a song called "Zip Tune" to the same melody. The melody and he invented a character Zip Tune, which was one of the standard. Zip Coon was like the pimp hustler, dandy character in racist caricature, as opposed to the Jim Crow character that Rice corrected, who was the dumb shuffling, step and fetch it type. And the song was very popular in minstrelsy and the parody. And in the 1860s, somebody who's I forget his name wrote another tune to this tune called "The Turkey in the Straw," which added, So I tend to I don't see anything wrong with performing "Turkey in the Straw." And but it depends on the context. I would not like I don't like people who I don't know anyone who would perform Zip Coon. I mean, you could go to a Klan rally and people would say that song is too the song and the image was too racist. I mean, we have to look at context. I mean, like Foster. Foster was an inveterate racist. His whole life of him and his family was connected with the most pro-slavery political faction in American politics, the Doe-face faction of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, whose most outstanding representative was James Buchanan, President of the United States, who said there couldn't be enough slavery in the United States, whose brother was married to Foster's sister. And Foster he wrote campaign songs for Douglas and other candidates against Nixon. He wrote songs against emancipation. His family is reputed to have sheltered the Confederate, the Vallandigham, I can't say the guy's name's right, who was a Ohio congressman who Lincoln exiled from the United States to Canada for being a Copperhead during the Civil War, and when he snuck back into the United States. And Foster's family is reputed to have sheltered him. But at the same time, Foster was a person, because of the other alcoholism and other problems seemed to run in his family, and he lived a life, both in his parental family and his personal life, of constant decline of his standard of living, losing the family home. And some of the songs that he wrote express that, like "Hard Times," or even "The Old Folks at Home," which has its performance context written for a minstrel show, which would be a slave who had run away from the North, feeling sorry that he did, feeling sentimental for the old folks back there still being enslaved. But you remove them from that context, and they're touching songs. I don't agree with the idea that any song that was performed by the minstrel should not be performed today. Then you get rid of a lot of old time music. You're going to get rid of a lot of music that African American old time musicians perform. Sandy Boys. I mean, you look in the minstrel tutors, you can find Sandy Boys and all of those tunes like that. The minstrels said that they were performing black string band music, that they had learned this from the black, and a lot of it that they did. So I mean, this is a dirty world. Only myself and a few of my favorite associates think pure, unbiased thoughts, but we have to be sensitive. I bought this Gene Ritchie electro record in 1962 at E.J. Corvette's in Hartford, Connecticut. And it has this tune on it called Jimmy Taylor O. Had a little trouble on the other end of town. Nobody killed but a man knocked down. Ain't it a shame for Jimmy Taylor on? And I like that tone, especially because it's the same tune as Little Sadie, and I don't enjoy singing songs boasting about murdering women or anybody else. And then Peter Siegel said to me on Facebook a couple years ago, "Have you ever heard the original version of that tune that Alan Lomax collected from Gene Ritchie, as opposed to this version, the versions that on the Lomax archives that she did, uh, that were collected in the 40s and the 50s?" And it's had a little trouble in the other end of town. Nobody killed but an N-word knocked down. And I don't want to sing that song, but I mean, as much as I love music and playing music, the most important thing in my life has been being active politically, trying to change the world. I mean, I have devoted much more in my life to that than this, and that's how you're going to do these things. Not interrogating every song that is sung by a person, but changing the world. And I don't want to get into what I think we should do about that, but that's my feeling. But I think you have to come to reckoning about what these things are. But it's context. You take this tune, Alabama Gals, Buffalo Gals. In the 1830s and 1840s, there's this enormous explosion of prostitution in the cities and the milieus where minstrelsy existed, because the same factors that sent many men off farms, uh, all sorts of things. It's been estimated, say, in 1845 or 1846 in New York City, 1 out of every 7 women in New York City was a sex worker. In 1845 or 1847, the term gal was a word for a prostitute. And those two songs, it would be a different Buffalo Gals, Alabama Gals, you know, Oakland Gals, Berkeley Gals, Albany Gals, Richmond Gals, and then they would unacceptable things would be said about the prostitutes of the town that the song was about. That's originally part of what it was. We live in a world where lots of things were changed. Where lots of things were just so much worse. The things are pretty bad now, but in which, and looking at these, what is the context when something happened is important, but what is the context today? And again, I think the main way you're going to change the world is by changing the world, and not jumping on somebody who sings a song because the song comes from somewhere. You know, that's that's uh, that's my feeling. I mean, minstrelsy was bad. I didn't really look at it until I got asked to do something that approached it for Oxford University Press about 10 years ago, and all of these things. If you look at America, especially before the Civil War, you would say that even as bad as things were, things got better. I mean, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Tony. Do you want? There's one more question. Should we? Is it okay? Do you have time to go for
Yeah,
it?
I have time.
Okay. So the final question we had was from Clark, who asks, in the book and movie Roots, the character Fiddler plays an important role. Do you know if it were common for enslaved people to learn European instruments and perform for the non-enslaved whites?
Well, in fiddling was as popular or more popular than banjo playing among Africans in the New World from the jump. I have a riti, which is a Gambian fiddle up there, and it reports there's a great thing in Banjo Roots and Branches, a survey that the greatest banjo scholar to live after Dina, Robert Winans, did of runaway slave advertisements from the colonial period, and the most common instrument mentioned because would be the fiddle. And fiddling with West African instruments is very common in West Africa, in the parts of West Africa the enslaved came from. And fiddling with violins was pretty much new as a folk practice in the English-speaking world. Alan Jabor wrote a paper that I have somewhere where he says that he points out that fiddling with a violin, as opposed to other instruments, as a folk practice, was something as new to the enslaved people who came to North America as it was to common white people in Europe. And there's very, very early interchange in the 1700s, maybe even in the 1600s, between black fiddling and not only fiddling among Americans, but even fiddling in the British Isles. There's a Dubow's Review, which was a magazine published in the South for slaveholder. This is like a trade journal of how to be a slave master. There's this famous article or exchange, as you do in these trade magazines, about the importance for, if you're running a plantation, to allow one of the slaves to become a fiddler and to put out some money, get him a good fiddler, make sure he can expand, he can change, get new strings and rosin and stuff like that, because it's so important for you to have peace on the plantation if they do have a good fiddler. But fiddling was, as it goes back and forth to me, whether fiddling was more widespread than banjo playing until, say, the 1840s among African Americans or not. But it certainly was widespread, and it was widespread not just something that was done for whites, although that gave that an advantage, but it was widespread something that goes on inside the African American community and inside black music. I mean, Count Basie and Duke Ellington had violinists who could fiddler, and the guy Claude Williams, who played Claude Fiddler Williams, that was his nickname, with Count Basie. John Hammond had him fired because he wanted to hire Freddie Green as the guitar player, and Williams was also the top jazz guitar player of the year with Basie. But Claude, I think he passed away in the 90s, came to a number of fiddle camps and showed fiddle tunes that he knew. But fiddling and the violin is, as bad as the violin is, as difficult an instrument is, this West African reedy fiddle, okay, with one string, and it has a pole for a neck, and you have the system of little ropes that you have to do to tune the thing, makes a violin. I have a friend whose father was a famous fiddler, playing the music in Iraq originally, and after the Jews were expelled from Iraq and Israel, and had made records and stuff. She said her father told her how his generation, when the violins were introduced as opposed to the previous instruments that were used in the Middle East that are the ancestors of violins, holy mackerel, this thing is easy to play. And there's this wonderful violin music that's part of the music in the Mideast. Look up on YouTube the National Arab Orchestra of the which is of the United States, based largely in Detroit, and it has some fantastic. There's fantastic violin music in the Arab East, but fiddling was either more common than banjo. Probably was more common among the enslaved, both for their own music than banjos. And
Uh, all right. Well, let's do one final question. We have one final question, if that's okay. This is from Maxine, and she was saying, interesting to hear of Stephen Foster's racist roots. But I wonder about, say, the song Angeline the Baker and Foster's apparent empathy with the forcible parting of Angelina from the viewpoint of the singer.
well, I've heard that version of the song only once. Well, he had some empathy, but I mean, he was no. It was his opinions on this were not his family his opinions about this were not guarded. That is to say that Foster his sister was married. His sister was married to the brother of the president of the United States in this period. His whole family business was politics. His father was a ward healer, what you would call a ward healer, and the big struggle in Foster's family for Foster's life was to get him a job with a patronage job as a clerk with the federal government that would last. And their whole tie-up with politics with Foster was not, and with people on slavery was not abstract. And if you look at some of Foster's songs, I mean, like I say, a bunch of Nazis, if you played the original versions that Foster wrote for Oh Susanna, they might think it was an objectionable song. And this was not a secret. I'm sure Foster, if you look at Foster's music and at his life, he obviously is somebody who endured a lot of personal suffering, and people dispute what exactly the reason for that was, and privation, and what a writer I like used to call a slipping down life. I mean, he ended up drinking himself to death in the Bowery during the Civil War. But his own views about slavery, and I'm sure he had a lot of where he gets to express empathy because he knew difficulty in life, and it seemed both material difficulty and probably emotional difficulty. That's something that both looking at Foster's actual life and his music, a lot of it came through. But I mean, his views, which he tried to express, is particularly as he was tied in with a family whose the main center of things was, being in politics, being elected officials or being appointed officials, and trying to get him jobs based on that. And it's not, so I'm sure he had a lot of empathy, and he expresses that. But his opinions his opinions on these issues were clear. It's just he wrote hundreds and hundreds of songs, and some of these songs are remembered, and some of them weren't. He tended to be ashamed of the minstrel songs, or he sold them, especially to Christie. Many of the minstrel songs that he's identified with were not published in his name, but he would sell them to major minstrel performers, and you had the feeling that even others were published in other names because he and his family were a bit felt like the minstrel stage was a little too vulgar to their whatever material privation they faced. we're a little bit beneath them.
Wow. Well, Tony, I want to thank you
Well,
so
this is
much
fun.
for
Yeah,
an
very good.
amazing, beautiful presentation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well,
Hey, Tony.
let me just say one thing. Those of us, there's a tight little group of people who discuss banjo history, and we are lousy at getting out. Thank you. We need less me and more playing here. But we're lousy at getting out what's going on to the public, to the banjo public. And so any, you know, chance to talk about these things and beyond the small circle of 10 or 15 people who've been emailing each other for the last 25 years is good. And we need more people to think about these things. And okay, we're finished. Thanks,
Thank
I
you,
guess.
Yeah, thank you.
Tony. Hey, Tony.